In lesson 6, we're going to be talking about layer attributes, and there's a lot of different attributes associated with layers. Every layer has several attributes that can be used to assist in how that layer interacts with all the other layers that are happening in your layers palette or your layers stack. So first things first, let's go ahead and look at our layers stack. Go ahead and open up our lesson 6 example 1. It's a PSD document, which means it's a Photoshop based document because it has layers in it. And we have circles on top of a blue background. And this is really just for demonstration purposes to showcase some of the things that we have in our layer attributes. So what you'll notice is that any pixel-based layer that you bring into Photoshop, that's a picture from your camera that comes in from Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, so long as it's a regular pixel-based layer and not something called a smart object, which we'll talk about in a whole nother course because it's a whole nother can of worms in and of itself. But anything brought in from Photoshop, Camera Raw, or your computer that's a JPEG that you bring in is going to have an attribute already associated with it. Photoshop is going to open up that document with something that says background because it's the bottom-most pixel-based layer that everything that's happening on top of it is working with. Right next to it, you're going to see a lock. That lock is essentially a layer attribute. There are a lot of different layer attributes. What I want you to notice is these areas right here that are grayed out when we're talking about layered attributes on this background image. On this background image, notice how we can't change anything in here because it's grayed out. When we click on these circles, we have access to blend modes, opacity, fill, and other layer attributes. That's because this background layer needs to have that pixel data for Photoshop to do all of that work on. So those pixel-based layers are locked by default so that Photoshop can essentially work on some pixel source to build everything else up on. If you don't want it locked and you want to do some work with it, you have to unclick this little lock because this basically says that something about this is what they call partially locked. Why do we know it's partially locked? Well, because it was a lock with a light gray inner. If you were to click on this layer right here, on this icon right here, that will lock all of the attributes and it will be a solid lock on that layer. Now there's many different types of locks that you can put on your layers. If we look over here, there's something called a transparency lock. Well, there are no transparent pixels in this layer. And how do I know that? Because this background layer, or what now is called layer 0, is filled with all blue. If we turn the preview off on this, which is an attribute, this attribute is basically saying that this layer is visible. If we turn that off, this layer has transparent area. How do I know that? Because it's the area not filled with those pixel-based circles. So the cool thing about this is without even using something called a layer mask, which is a whole nother attribute, without even using a layer mask, I can click on this right here that says lock transparent pixels. What that means is that if I were to take a brush, just press B for the brush tool and whatever color you have selected, that's fine. If you want, you can go into your color picker over here and I am going to pick this orange color. If I were to start painting on this, I'll just click and drag across. Look at that. It's not going in those transparent areas. Why is that? Well, that's because we locked the transparency. If we turn the lock transparent pixels layer off, attribute off, look what happens. Now we can paint all over this without having those locked transparent pixels. If we were to turn that lock back on, it's not going to help us because now these areas are the transparent pixels around it, which is outside of this orange area. So if we changed our color to something like gray, started painting back, it will allow us to paint in any area that has transparent pixels. What happened there is that we put pixels in those transparent areas. So now it's still locking down those transparent pixels. That's a really cool lock feature to use. I'm going to go step back a little bit here. The other thing right here is the locking of the image pixels. So if we were to lock the image pixels, we cannot now paint on these pixel values. If we use our brush tool, it's going to give us this error message that says could not use the brush tool because that layer is locked. And what specifically is locked on it are those pixels. It's saying preserve these pixels, don't allow them to be messed with. That is what we'd also consider a partial lock. Here is a move lock where that layer can no longer be moved. Now we have it set up so it now can no longer be moved, nor can you actually adjust the pixels. If we were to say it can't be moved and it now is locking the transparent areas, we can't move it, but we can still paint on it and it won't go outside those transparent areas. If we press V for the move tool, it will not let us move it because it says we cannot move this layer because it's locked. Now, if we want to lock everything down, this other one here is artboards. I don't use artboards too much. That's typically a graphic design thing. But if we were to say lock all, now nothing on this layer can have any of its attributes affected. That's really important when you want to lock down everything in this layer, from its transparency to its pixels to moving it, and to the opacity, the fill, and the blend modes of that. These are other attributes. Blend modes in and of themselves are a whole nother course that we could work on for days. So we aren't going to talk too much about blend modes here, but that is an attribute of a layer because it alters the state of that layer. Therefore, it is an attribute that can be associated with that layer. The opacity is another one. If we drop the opacity on the circles, the blue is going to show through. We're basically saying that we want this set of gray circles to be 50% opaque, which will allow the gray of those pixels to mix with the blue of the pixels underneath. Now, fill is very similar to opacity in that it's going to affect how much of something is visible. If we have a pixel-based layer like this, fill is pretty much going to mean nothing. The only time fill comes in is when we have that combined with blend modes. So fill is associated with blend modes for the most part, and layer styles, which is something that we're also going to be talking about as a layer attribute. So the interesting thing is if we bring this opacity all the way up, if we double click on any one of our layers, it's going to open up what's called the layer styles. There is a bunch of layer styles in here, all kinds of different layer styles. As a matter of fact, most of these you probably won't be using on pixels when you're adjusting and experimenting with your images, but you will use this stuff on text. The only really reason why I jump in here for pixel-based layers during my landscape editing is when I'm doing things in this blend if section here. But for the most part, I'm using this layer style area when I'm doing things like adding a drop shadow. So I can add a drop shadow underneath these circles, so now they have a layer attribute, which is essentially that shadow that's underneath them. That shadow that's underneath them, we can go ahead and move the distance on that shadow and change the spread and the size of that shadow. We can even adjust the distance or the angle of it, but we can just click anywhere around here and adjust that as well. So I can bring that down to here. The interesting thing about this is that when we get into adding that layer style attribute and then getting into fill, if I drop the fill on this down, look what happens. Those circles disappear, but their drop shadows stay, which is different than opacity. If I start dropping opacity down, it brings all of that circle down along with its drop shadow. So the interesting thing about fill is that fill is the actual amount of pixels that are within that given layer or space. It also works hand in hand with those blend modes, as we'll talk about in another course, a completely different course on blend modes and blend modes alone. The thing that I want you to gather from fill here is fill, when it comes to pixel-based layers, is associated to what those pixels are filling in. So if we start to drop the fill, we're losing that pixel-based data, but we're keeping its layer styles or its drop shadow that we've added there. If we turn those effects off, which that's what these layer styles are attributed to, guess what? We lose our drop shadow. See how interesting that is? We turn that back on, we now have that drop shadow back. So those layer attributes that we have so far are things like your blend modes, which we'll talk about in another course, opacity, fill, your lock features, and your layer styles. Those are all attributes that can be attributed to a layer. Another thing that can be attributed to a layer, let's go ahead and reset the fill on this to 100%. We'll turn the drop shadow off. If we want to get rid of these effects, we can right click on them and we can just say hide all effects or clear layer styles. And if we clear the layer styles, they'll go away. If we hide them, it just takes the preview away. The next thing we have is a temporary attribute called a mask. A mask is anything that is put onto a layer. If we click this mask right here, we will get a layer mask, which is an attribute to this layer. It looks like a white fill, doesn't it? What that white fill is telling you, though, is that anything that is white within this mask will allow that stuff to stay. If we brush with B with our brush tool and we brush somewhere along these circles, it will start to disappear. See that? Now notice I'm not painting with the color blue, am I? What I'm doing is I'm painting on this attribute or this mask that's associated with this layer. And what that means is that anything that's white will stay on that layer. Anything that's black will disappear and show the underlying stuff through. So this is a temporary way to modify those pixels without destroying them, because at any time if I go back to white, I can start painting that area back on. This is masking in its simplest form. There are a ton of different ways to mask, and there's many different ways that we can make a mask. But what I want you to gather from this really here is that a white mask next to a layer means that that layer can completely exist within this layer space. The minute we paint with black by pressing B for our brush tool, D to default our colors to black and white, and X to switch back and forth between black and white, with X pressed and I start to paint with black, it will make these circles disappear. However, that circle is not gone, okay? If I press X to switch back over to white and I paint back on there, it's now back. This layer attribute, or this mask, is an attribute because it can be turned on and off. So let's say I paint somewhere on here with black. I'll paint a little X on here with black. If I press Shift and I click on that mask, it is going to temporarily disable the temporary mask effect and basically say, okay, did you want to see what this looked like without this mask on? Press and hold Shift and you can see that. If you press Alt or Option and you click on it, that will show us anywhere that we painted on this mask with black. You can see that there's some excess areas here that we don't necessarily want. The best thing to do is, if we wanted to keep this X here, is to switch over our brush to white and then paint these black areas out. Because if you're doing a composite, if you're doing anything else that deals with heavy masking, more specifically compositing in Photoshop, you're going to want to clean up these areas that end up being black outside of the area that you actually wanted to mask. Masks can get a little bit messy, and we could probably do an entire course. Actually, I have done an entire course completely on masks, because masks are a very important piece to this entire puzzle. So now, how does all of this layer attribute stuff affect us when we're editing? Well, let's just hop into this image right here. This is one of the other layer lesson 6 example images. You can see that we already don't have the lockbox on there. This is an unlocked layer 0. If yours is locked, go ahead and press unlock just to get in the habit of unlocking those pixel-based layers if you want to be able to edit them. Let's do something and show you how these adjustment layers, which we talked about in the previous lesson, affect our overall image as we edit. So if I were to come down here and add something like a curves adjustment layer, you'll see that that curves adjustment layer is applying itself on top of the image. Nothing's happening because we haven't done anything yet. Its attributes are set to keep it set to normal with opacity at 100%, fill at 100%, and our curve is not modified at all. The curve is an awesome adjustment layer that you will learn all about as you go through my courses, because I use it all over the place. But the basic adjustment on a curve would be to take this segment right here, just click this and drop it down to make a darker area in the image, or to add more contrast to our dark areas, and pick this up and make the overall image brighter. So what we're doing is we're saying temporarily make the contrast in this image lighter and darker. And the attribute to this is that this is now on. We can see that. If we turn it off, this has no effect at all because it's an adjustment layer. Remember, it knows no bounds. It affects those pixels. So if we turn that visible layer on, and then we were to change this to something like soft light, you would see a different blend mode being applied to this image, or a different attribute being applied to this curve, which is affecting the entire image. If I drop the opacity, it's going to make this effect less intense. Now, if I paint on the mask by using my brush tool set to black, and I paint away areas that I don't want that to affect, because maybe I don't want it to be so bright down here, and just keep it bright in the sky, I have now used one single layer and all of its attributes to increase the contrast in the overall photograph. So the main things that I really want you to gather from this is that there's many different attributes to any given layer on your stack. And the reason why I'm telling you about this, and even with 10 years of experience in Photoshop, I would make these giant composites with lots of different images in them, lots of different layers. Some of those layers were just one layer and then another layer on top of it to do an effect that I could have done if I just used one layer and all of the attributes in that one layer. Essentially what I was doing is I was chasing my tail, adding all of these different layers on top of each other, and I wasn't taking advantage of things like those blend modes in those layers, or the opacity, or the mask, or the fill, I just kept making more and more layers because I didn't understand the concept of masking. I didn't understand the concept of fill or opacity or layer styles. So I kept stacking things on top of each other, making what we call a very destructive workflow, when I could have simplified all of my work by doing it on one layer, just using all of the attributes of those layers more effectively and more efficiently. Now, I'm not saying that every image can be modified using one layer, but what I'm saying is that one layer has many different attributes that will affect your image differently. So keep all of those things in mind. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about layer organization. It's a really critical thing to understand how to organize your layers before you just dive headfirst into Photoshop.